What is up, everybody? Brian Mendler back in your life on another edition of the podcast. And today I am super excited to be joined by Jennifer Say. And Jen, it's first of all, it's good to meet you face to face. I've seen you a lot on Twitter and on social media. You're a huge open schools advocate, as am I. Obviously, and I was excited to talk to you today to just kind of hear your story. I know you started in San Francisco, you moved to Denver. So first of all, good to meet you, and tell me a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Yeah, it's good to meet you as well. My name's Jen Say. I've been in San Francisco for over 30 years. So I'm from Philadelphia, but went to San Francisco and made it my home. And I'm a filmmaker and a writer, and I have done a lot of advocacy for kids in my life. I'm a former elite athlete. I made the film Athlete A, and that deals with the issue of, abuse in sports. And so with schools shut down in San Francisco and in California now since March 13th, I've been advocating for open schools. And for me, this is very consistent with, my advocacy for kids in sport and, an attempt to rid the Olympic movement of abusive, cruel coaching. It's sort of an extension of that for me.
I'm interested to hear a little bit more about that. Can you share a little bit more about that?
About the school piece or the
No,
or the sports
the
piece?
athlete. Yeah, the sports
Sure.
piece.
Yeah, sure. No problem. So I was an elite athlete as a child. I was a gymnast. I was on the national team for 8 years and the national champion in 1986. And the sport is, I would say the standard of coaching is quite cruel and abusive. But that wasn't discussed very much until recently. And in fact, as a kid or a teenager, a young woman leaving the sport, I kind of suffered immensely from the trauma that had been inflicted in terms of the bullying and the shaming and being forced to train on injuries and all sorts of stuff. And sexual abuse is fairly rampant in the sport as well. And ultimately in 2008, I wrote a book called Chalked Up, which was really a memoir detailing my experiences, the sort of triumphs, but also the challenges. And I had no idea that I would be met with such opprobrium. And I was dismissed by those in the sport as a liar and a bitter, angry ex-gymnast. And really, I'd just written it to try to sort of make sense of it for myself. I was 40 when it came out, and I was still suffering. Now I understand that to be post-traumatic stress disorder. I did not understand it at the time. But anyway, then I became very involved with that as a spokesperson, trying to expose the abusive culture. And then back in about, when did it break? 2016, the story of Larry Nassar, the USA gymnastics team doctor who sexually abused hundreds of young athletes. That story broke. And I was involved with reporters and many of the athletes and came to be friends with many, many of them. And, it was clear to me that the fact that this man had been able to do that for 30 years, it was a system that allowed that, a system that silenced athletes and that abused athletes and forced nothing less than total obedience, which is what allowed him to do this and have these girls remain silent for so long.
Did you ever have an experience with him?
I didn't. It's interesting you say that because he started the year I left. So we had 1 year overlap. He was the trainer in 1987, which was my last year on the national team, but I never met him. I did have in my advocacy some exchanges with him on social media where he commended me oddly on speaking out. But that's kind of how he was. He, befriended the athlete, and amidst all of this cruelty and coaching, he was this sort of safe space, which is, one of the ways that he groomed. That's how he groomed the athletes, and it allowed him to do what he did for so long. I didn't realize who he was when he had reached out and kind of commended me for that. So anyway, in the process of getting to know all these athletes who had come forward, I had the idea that a documentary film would be really telling and emotionally resonant. And so I found some directors and pitched them on the idea. And I think the main thing I would just say is it was really important to me to connect this abuse, this monstrous single person, to an entire system, because he couldn't have done it without this support and this really broken, rotten system. And so, while it starts with him, it does connect it to that broader culture. And that was the important story for me to tell.
So how hard was that as a kid though? Like, so because I'm guessing, you obviously it's a double-edged sword because you love the sport, right? And you
Yeah.
want to be a part of it. And, as a kid, you trust your coaches and you kind of trust what they tell you. And what a kind of difficult spot to be in.
That's what's so difficult is you sort of idolize these coaches and you hand yourself over to them and you give them total obedience because they are going to give you what you want in return, which is to make the national team. And you slowly start to disintegrate, essentially, or I did, under the weight of the abuse and the injuries. So it's really difficult and it's hard to make sense of, as a child and as a young adult. And I think that's why I continued to suffer over the years emotionally. It's incredibly difficult. And, one of the things I wanted to come across in the book was the devastation of losing this thing that you love so much. And I was essentially, sorry, that's my son running
No, that's
around.
cool. I see
Um,
that.
uh, I mean, I loved it like nothing else, and I feel in a sense that it was stolen from me. And I walked away from the sport just totally broken and ashamed, essentially. And I should have had a great sense of pride in what I'd achieved, but I just felt completely broken and ashamed of myself.
How do you feel toward the sport today?
I love the athletes. You'll never meet a harder working group of young men and women or children. I love the passion they have for the sport. The sport is beautiful. I don't think you can find more amazing athletes in the world. But I think that the culture is utterly broken and rotten to the core, and it needs to be reimagined from the ground up. And I don't think we're there yet, despite all of the publicity and, the awakening essentially that Athlete A has brought on. The athletes are demanding more and the former athletes, but the leadership in the sport has still not, I think they've still failed to kind of recognize the cultural shift required. So, I love the sport and I want what's best, but mostly what I want is for children not to be abused. And
Yeah.
if that means, people have asked me, do you want the sport to go away? I mean, that's not my intention, certainly. My intention is that the sport is safe and supportive and heeds principles of child development. But if they can't do that and it goes away, then I guess it is what it is, because the most important thing is these kids' physical and emotional safety.
It's interesting to see because I have a daughter. So my daughter is 7 and she loves, doing cartwheels and tumbling and she takes gymnastics. I mean, but there's different levels, even at the place we go to. I mean,
Yeah.
you see when they're young and they really separate them pretty quick. The ones
Yeah.
who, and the ones that they think are going to go places. I mean, it is intense. And I'm glad actually that my daughter's not in that group. My
Yeah.
daughter's in the sort of the group of just go and have fun. And,
Yeah.
no one's really, and you can just tell, you can see the
Yeah.
difference on the different sides, but it's, what kind of injuries did you have that you have to had you to push yourself through?
Oh my goodness. The most sort of spectacular, if you can call it that, was at the 1985 World Championships. I broke my femur, so that's the thigh bone
Yep.
on my last event. And I came back from that in about 9 months to win the national championships. But I broke both ankles. The second ankle that I broke, I learned many years later, I'd shattered it and I trained on it, broken for 2 years. And that's the one that causes the most problems today. So the two broken ankles, the femur, but all kinds of broken fingers, concussions, stress fractures, shin splints. It got so bad when I was 16 or 17, I had to take about 10 Advil at the beginning of practice and then another 6 in the middle.
Oh.
I had cortisone shots in my ankle every 6 weeks just to be able to kind of walk out on the competition floor. So it's an incredibly dangerous sport. And that creates a whole other sort of psychological trauma, the fear of the danger and then of course pushing through the injuries. I unfortunately, and this is pretty standard practice in the sport, never allowed any of them to heal, which is why I kept repeating injuries. I would break one ankle and then I'd break the other, and that because I'd favor the leg and
Yeah.
not the issue is that the kids are so young, and in the sport it's viewed that you need to be young and tiny, and so there's this narrow window of opportunity.
Yeah.
And so we don't let our injuries heal because we push back to make it to that season. You can't miss a season because your time's up at 17, or that's how it's viewed anyway.
Yeah.
I don't believe that's true. And I think if I had been allowed to heal, I think I could have lasted even longer. But eventually the pain does get the better of you.
I feel like though you'd have to have, so not just the system, but also, I mean, what about your parents? Like, were they involved, and like, did they kind of let you go through this or push you to, because I would think
Good
they would be
question.
involved somehow.
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually moved away from home when I was 14. And so I was
Mm,
training sort of outside of the visibility of my parents. And in many gyms, parents aren't even allowed in to
I
watch, which is
know.
a red flag in and of itself. And for many years, I did blame my parents for sort of allowing this to happen. I think, and certainly parents have a responsibility, and I encourage parents now to really truly understand a coach's philosophy. Is it child centered? Is it centered around your child's development and building healthy self esteem and healthy bodies, which is what sports should be about, right? But honestly, parents aren't aware. They're groomed in the same way the kids are. So
Mm,
they're sort of groomed to believe that this is normal and what's required. Um, should they resist that? Absolutely, but it does happen. And the kids hide it. I didn't tell my parents because I wanted this thing. It was
yeah.
my dream. And so I was afraid if I told them how much I was suffering, they would pull me out, as any parent would probably do.
Which, yeah.
So yes, parents have an ultimate responsibility for their kids, but you read reports of these national training camps at the Caroli Ranch. No
Right.
one's allowed, no
Yeah.
parents. These are very young children, 10, 12, 13 years old, going to this ranch in the middle of nowhere with no cell service and no parents. So I think parents are awakened now to this
Yeah.
fact, but the fact is there are many that buy into it, and they buy into this notion of this is what's required to make champions. And that's unfortunate. But I think athletes and parents are pushing back now, which is great because the leadership is not making the required change. And I'm sure this is a tangent, not what you wanted to talk
No,
about,
this
but
is great. This is way
it's
better.
it's
This
what
is
I've
the,
spent the last sort of 12 or 13 years of my life advocating for and focusing on. And it's interesting because when my book came out in 2008, it was really quite harrowing. The bullying I received online, the threats, and I feel like it sort
really.
of prepared me in a sense for what you and I are sort of fighting for now. I mean, that was sort of like kids play compared to this, but I didn't expect it. I wrote the book alone in my room. I didn't expect it to get published necessarily. And so I didn't, and it was early days of social media. So I didn't fully understand what that would feel like. I also didn't fully understand that don't read the comments, just don't. Like now we know that, right? I didn't. And I
It's
just
hard
went,
not to, though.
yeah, I went into the very dark places and was harassed endlessly. And eventually, but not until the Nasser story broke and sort of in the last 3 years, people came to support this message. But they seem to have conveniently forgotten that they didn't support me before, but that's fine.
Interesting.
I welcome all who want to make the sport safer, and all sports. I mean, that's the other thing is, I hear from athletes in all, in track and field, ice skating, even in dance. And you mentioned that there is this sort of very early on, this separation of the, very talented and promising from those who perhaps are
Yeah.
just doing it recreationally. I think that's true. And it's unfortunate. At 7 years old, I was training 12, 15 hours a
Yeah.
week, which is arguably too much for a 7-year-old. But for the coaches who are the most abusive, they really don't differentiate between a child with promise and one that maybe is recreationally involved. And so everybody gets it,
Yeah.
everybody's getting weighed in. And that's the problem. If we view it only as an issue at the elite level, we haven't really addressed the broader cultural
Sure.
issue.
I think it's interesting because my daughter's gymnastics place, so late, the COVID era has given them more excuse to not allow people in, right? That's
Mm,
another thing that
interesting. Yeah.
annoys me about COVID, is that I feel like a lot of places are using that as a way to keep parents away from watching their kids. And
Yeah, that's interesting.
that's been true. And I've actually been one who goes anyway into the gymnastics thing, and I'm the only one in there. So I sit in there and it's great. My daughter goes for 2 hours. I can watch her. And literally I just got an email a couple days ago saying I'm not allowed in anymore. And it annoys
Interesting.
me because I really don't trust anybody very much. I really,
Yeah.
especially with my kids, and that sport is notorious. So I'm sitting here thinking to myself how ridiculous I am, because I came on to talk to you about one thing and I had no idea actually who you were. And the thing is that I try to intentionally not find out
That's
about people
okay.
before I do these.
Yeah.
So are you the athlete A, that was Netflix, correct?
That's the Netflix
And
film. Yeah.
so were you the producer of that? Like, what did you have?
Yeah.
That was an amazing, I watched it. It
Oh,
was
good. Thank
spectacular.
you. Yeah, I was the producer. I actually sort of initiated the whole thing.
No
I mean,
way.
I'm not a, I knew I couldn't direct it, but I knew I had access to, the athletes and that they trusted me. These young women were getting just an onslaught of media requests. And I think many felt their story was being told inaccurately. And so the fact that they trusted me as someone that had spoken out early on the subject enabled me to kind of, get them to agree to participate. And they trusted that we would tell their story faithfully. And it wasn't just the athletes I knew. I knew the civil attorney, the prosecuting attorney, the detective, the reporters. And so I kind of put the idea of the story together and the way that we could connect Nasser to this broader culture of abuse. And then I went and tried to find directors that I felt could do it justice. And I quickly was introduced to a husband and wife team um, in San Francisco, where I live or sort of live now.
Right.
Bonnie Cohn and John Shank, and they've done another film on sexual assault. So I really believed in their ability to tell this story in a really empathetic way and treat the survivors with empathy, because these are hard things, hard stories to
Absolutely.
tell, right? They didn't want to do it at first. They'd just finished a film on teenage sexual assault called Audrey and Daisy, but I kept persisting and bothering them until they said yes. And then, creatively, they obviously owned the process, but I, as the producer, helped bring in the talent and or the featured
Sure.
survivors and the
Sure.
other folks on camera, and I'm in it as well as the sort of voice of history, connecting the culture
Yeah.
to this instance of Nasser.
My favorite part of that of the documentary was I think it was the end. It was when they all got to confront him in the courtroom,
Yeah,
and like just all, and it was all of them, and they were just all
it's
boom,
very
one after
powerful.
another. It was so powerful. I remember watching that, just thinking, and in the end, they all get theirs. In the end, you do wrong to people, it comes around,
I
and
think so.
uh,
Yeah, the victim impact statements in Lansing are really, really powerful. And that was the prosecuting attorney, Angie Povolitis, negotiated that as part of the deal, that everyone who wanted to speak could speak. And well over 100 spoke. At the beginning of the week, only a few had planned to, but as they watched from across the country online, these young women wanted to come and confront him. And I think it was part of the healing process, certainly, although the healing continues.
what, so I'm curious, like, what made you become the person who spoke out sort of first? I mean, that had to be so incredibly difficult, and it was at a time where I feel like it's more received today, right? You're seeing it with certain politicians now, where people are coming out and people embrace that versus
Yeah.
the opposite.
Yeah, like I said, I think I think it builds. I don't think it's this sort of like I am this person that risks everything to speak out, right?
Sure.
Like I said, I wrote the book in my room to try to sort through some of my own trauma. Didn't fully anticipate what the backlash would be. But it was swift and fairly severe, which strengthened my resolve in a sense. I felt like I'd touched a nerve. But I was very careful at first to say this was my story. It wasn't an indictment of the sport. But as the blowback became more intense, I got stronger, and I really was alone at first, and it was difficult. But that strengthens you, and so it that has been part of my, I guess, journey, if you will, to kind of know that you have to stand up for kids and you have to do what is right despite the challenge you may face. It's worth it for kids, and folks will come around, hopefully. And even if they don't, you have to do it. Kids are vulnerable and they don't have a voice. They can't vote. Um, you know, and so I think that process is part of my kind of finding my own voice about doing what's right. And the way it sort of unfolded 12 years later, to have people realize that this indeed was wrong and that I had been right, kind of proved that for me, with persistence, you can break through, but it's very difficult and it can take a very long time. It was over a decade of people calling me a liar and a sort of just in it for the money and the attention. Didn't really make much money and the attention was mostly negative.
Of
So I'm not
course,
sure.
right. Who would
No,
want that kind of attention?
no
I mean,
one.
right, right.
But it's kids, like I said, and I don't know how anyone cannot, see a child being abused and not want to stand up for that child.
Yeah.
I just, I don't understand that, you know.
I'm with you. And I think that kind of brings us to, to the next point, which is, so you're in Denver now, right? You've kind of notorious for picking your son up and moving to Denver from San Francisco because you want to get him in school, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't expect it to get that much attention. You probably saw it, but I sort of tweeted right before we left for Denver. And, I think Jake Tapper retweeted it and then it went a little crazy.
Right.
But yeah, I have 4 kids. They're very divided in age. I have 2 older. And my younger kids, I have a kindergartner. So I have one that's in college and one that's a senior in high school. But my 6-year-old had, his experience of kindergarten was 2.5 hours of Zoom a day. That was kind of it. And so he has no understanding of what it is to be in a classroom and have a teacher that shows interest and have classmates. And I just saw him progressively over the course of, 7-8 months become withdrawn. And I mean, if you can say a 6-year-old's depressed, I guess that's what I was
Yeah,
observing.
you can say it.
He didn't want to, I don't have a diagnosis or anything,
Yeah,
but
I
he was
hear
very
you.
withdrawn, through a lot of tantrums, which he'd never done. He didn't want to leave the house, which was the most concerning. And this was a very boisterous, active kid. He didn't want to go out at all. San Francisco is very restrictive. Playgrounds were closed through September. They just opened fairly recently. At playgrounds now, kids are required to stay 6 feet apart, so they can't really play with each other. All kid activities, kid sports are up until, I think they just in the last couple of days said that they're allowed again. So, and he was a sporty kid, he did soccer and basketball and all sorts of things. And he just didn't want to do anything. And so my husband and I became increasingly worried and alarmed. And as we sort of pushed for San Francisco schools to open and met with just nothing but total resistance, it became very clear that schools were not going to open in the fall and probably not in the spring, although there's a recent announcement we can talk about, which is, in my
Absurd. It's a
opinion,
joke.
entirely cosmetic.
It's an absolute embarrassment. And,
Yeah.
and it's, they're not the only one. And what she's talking about is they basically came out and they said they're going to open a couple of schools for like 2 hours or something like that.
Yeah.
It's one of those.
Yeah. It's basically by the middle of April, they're going to open 6 out of 64 elementary schools and only K through 2. So nothing
Right.
for 3 through
Right.
5 and not full time.
Right.
And I did just find out last night, my son's school is on that list. People have asked me if I regret coming, but I don't, because 1, that's 5 weeks from now. 2, it's not full time. So anyway, we
Yeah.
observed our son becoming, increasingly more withdrawn, and we just have very little hope that school will even be normal in the fall of this year. I'm fairly confident it will not be. And so we just felt that we needed to do something, and we're lucky that we had the means to do it. And, that's one thing I've definitely been criticized for. Well, you have the means, not everyone can do this. And I realize that, and I am grateful for that. And that's why I continue to push for California schools to open for all kids. There's 53,000 kids in San Francisco who are not in school. And these tend to be kids, without means. Privates are open. Over 100 private schools have been open. But the irony is city-run learning hubs are also open. So these are places that the city has opened where kids can go to do the work or do their Zoom school, with Wi-Fi. There's a monitor, not a teacher, who will help kind of navigate if necessary. So these have been open since the fall, I think around 90 of them. So something like 6,000 kids. And these are kids that really, the most disadvantaged kids may not have Wi-Fi, perhaps both parents or one parent if it's a single parent home, or hourly workers and can't, no flexibility,
Yep.
foster children, homeless children. These are the ones attending the learning hubs. But the point being, the city runs these. They're in places like community centers and even schools in some instances, and they've had no outbreaks since September. So, the city can do this. And of course, there's a monitor in the quote unquote classroom, an adult who's
Right.
helping and overseeing, but not a teacher. So it's super frustrating. And I'm so sad for all the children of San Francisco and California. California is ranked last in school openings in the entire country. Dead last, which I
Yeah.
don't know how, that's indefensible.
I feel for you. I feel for you. And look, I'm in the same boat in the sense of, the privileged me. I'm sending two kids to private school right now. I mean, I can't really afford it, truthfully, but I'm
Right,
sacrificing other places in my life.
right.
I live in New York. I'm paying incredibly high taxes.
Yeah,
At least my schools are hybrid. So I mean, they
some
would be in
schools.
session 2 days, but that's not enough for me. Like
It's
it doesn't make sense to me. To me, kids need to be in school 5 days. And that's I don't it's just to me it's we're at the point of where I shake my head every
Yeah,
day.
and I mean, parents, look, an education is a civil right. It's in the California Constitution. Right now, the way it's set up, at least in San Francisco, and I think more broadly across the country, and what you've described is kids with the means to go to private are able to access the education, and kids without the means are not. Now, again, I don't want to misrepresent myself. I have the means. I could send my kids to private. I choose public. I've been very happy up until now with the public school system in San Francisco.
Same.
My two older boys, my oldest is a junior at Berkeley, one of the best universities in the world, quite literally a public university, and he was educated in the San Francisco public school system. So I love what this system had to offer. I don't want to abandon it. But when you're left with no choice because the service is simply not being offered, people are willing to do anything, whether it's, as you've done, scrape every dollar together to go to private, or what I've done, pick up and move the city that I love and have lived in over 30 years.
Hmm.
But I've heard from parents, and I'm sure you have as well. I mean, it isn't just parents with means who are doing this.
No.
People without means are trying to get out of wherever they are. I mean, there was the piece in the New York Times just maybe 2 weeks ago about families in Philadelphia, which is where I grew up, who don't have money and they're moving to Florida. They're figuring out how to do it just so their kids can go to school. So, this isn't about, me being able to do what I did. This is about how desperate parents are to have their kids in school. And some would say, and there's been many articles written about San Francisco, that a large percentage of parents aren't comfortable sending their kids back. In fact, it's still the minority. It's about 40%. But every system has a virtual option when the
Right.
schools are open. So no one's forcing anyone to
Right.
send their kids back, but you are forcing families who want to access
Right.
in-person education to not have that option.
But it's even more of a reason, because the reality is when they come back, only 40 to 50% of the kids are going to actually come, which means you can easily handle all the protocols that they're putting in place. So,
It's
right.
true.
So and that's true everywhere. Like literally on a daily basis, I'm on with people from all over the country on a daily basis, different schools. That's what I do.
Yeah,
And that's the system. The system
that's right.
now is you open, half the kids come, the other half don't, for whatever
Uh,
reason. They're
but
entitled to
having
not.
that's right. And I understand that. I do
Right.
understand that people are fearful and that families are having very different experiences. Um, but I also have observed, as I'm sure you have, that when a district opens and shows that it is safe, more and more
Of
families
course.
join and sign up. I mean, Rhode Island is a great example of this. They opened and it was sort of in that 60% range, but very quickly got to 80%
Yep.
because families see then that it's safe. I think keeping the schools closed has this impact of keeping people more afraid, right? Because it signals that the danger is there. When they're open and it's safe and kids are learning again safely. It just sort of, it does open things up, and I think people are then encouraged. So I have, there was a survey last fall in San Francisco of public school parents. 58% said that they would send their kids back, which is a majority. It was somewhat differentiated by race. White parents were the highest. Black and Latinx families were at about the average, right in that sort of 57% zone. Asian families were least interested in sending their kids back. They were in the 40% zone. And I understand that it is differentiated across racial lines. But again, I think as schools open, parents become more confident that they can send their kids safely.
No question. And that's what's happening. And it's happening with every place that I talk to, where that's the progression. The progression is you start, about half come, and then slowly throughout the year, more and
Right.
more come back. And that's what it should be.
Yeah, the same thing happened, interestingly, with playgrounds in San Francisco. And, it may not sound like a big deal to have playgrounds closed, but when you live in a city, as you do, you don't probably have a yard. We don't have a yard. If you have two small children and you can't go to the playground, it's quite difficult. That's where they run and jump and socialize. And so when playgrounds first opened, when they first took the caution tape off last September, they were sparsely populated. Not that many people came, but they very quickly became more full because it just builds confidence and takes some of the fear away to see kids playing with each other.
No question. And I've been consistent since last March, right? I was one of the very few educators back in March saying, what is going on here, right? I mean, there should be a law that you should never be allowed to close a playground again. I mean, playgrounds you're going to talk about health and then closing the playground? It's like the ultimate, whatever they call it, the opposites, oxymoron or whatever, like jumbo shrimp, like, you know what I mean? And I'm lucky. Look, I live in upstate New York, so I have, and that was what I kept saying back in March and April, that this wasn't about me, right? I have a nice house. I have a pool. I have a playground in my backyard. I have a trampoline. My kids were set. I'm not kidding. Like my personal kids were fine. And that was my frustration it wasn't about me. It was about all of these kids who are stuck in places where they literally have nowhere to go all day. Of course they become depressed. How could you not?
Yeah. And I said the same and was sort of out early on this as well, because it seemed clear to me that without any clear metrics around what would prompt school openings, that they could very likely not open. And there were lots of folks who said, it's just 2 weeks. It's just 2 weeks. And I said, it's not going to be 2 weeks. And here we are a full year later. And I've said the same. This isn't really just about me. I don't have a yard and I don't have those things just because I'm in an urban setting, but I have the means to sort of, I have a car. I can drive where I want to drive to get my kids in the outdoors, et cetera. But this is about all the children. It's about the kids that my kids go to school with in San Francisco. And I've certainly seen amongst the older kids, and I don't think we talk enough about the older children. Right. There are kids in my kids' class who they've just fallen off you don't hear from them. We don't know what's happening with them. And I think for the older children in particular, the middle and high school children, we could lose these kids forever. With the younger ones, they can't really access online learning very well, right? I mean, my son can't even read. So he's 6 and he's in a bilingual school. So he speaks Spanish and English. They typically read later. It doesn't work for him, but for the old, he has time to get reintegrated into the system, right? He's 6. For kids that are in 8th grade who were struggling in school anyway and now become disengaged, or for juniors who are now sort of working an hourly job to help their families and were struggling in school anyway and are now disengaged, those kids aren't going to graduate, many of them. We don't have time to get them back in the system. And that to me is it's just utterly heartbreaking. And I look at the older children and the lack of socialization. These are kids who the point of their life right now is to separate from their parents, and they're home with their parents in their beds often all the time, doing Zoom or not doing it. And they're just sort of hopeless. They really are. How could they not be? Everything's been sort of taken from them, and they've sort of been told, the strong signal sent to these kids is your needs don't matter. And in fact, if you express sadness or you're selfish, because right. there's this thing happening, which is devastating. But your needs don't rank. And that's not who we are. I didn't think. Kids' needs should rank the highest of any. And so the teens really, really, that just breaks my heart. And I see my kids' friends suffering. And there's not even any discussion, in many markets. You mentioned San Francisco, and there's a small fraction of schools that will open for K through 2 only in April, which is 1 month left of the school year. Right. There's been no discussion about middle and high school yet.
Right. Like they don't even exist. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And those are the kids. Those are the kids we are hearing about, the sort of horrible mental health issues, the suicide and suicidal ideation, the self-harm. Eating disorders are exploding. And I don't know. So I just keep trying to talk to folks like you. I've said I'll talk to anyone who wants to talk to me about this. And in some cases, I've made choices to talk to folks that have brought a bit of criticism. I did a Fox News thing last week. But, I don't agree with a lot of.
What was the criticism?
Don't go on Fox. It was,
Oh,
I don't,
okay.
it's not a channel I really watch, and it's not, I don't agree with probably 99% of, what is espoused, but if you want to talk to me about opening schools, I'll do it. And I did. So I'll take the heat. It's okay.
I can't, I mean, but so that's the whole problem though. That's part of the enormous problem in our society, is that you can't go and talk to someone without feeling like you're going to get criticized or critiqued because it's the wrong person that you're talking to. It's
Yeah.
ridiculous. It makes absolutely no sense. And I'm with you. I keep saying it I've said it from, again, the start. I will vote for any human being in the world that says schools should be open and never close. Not only should they be open, but there should be a contingent that we put in right now that says they're never allowed to close again. That's what I think. I mean, if you're not going to close Costco and you're not going to close the liquor store, then how are you going to close my school? I mean, you don't close the fire station, and they never close the airport. I mean, there might only been 2 or 3 people on a flight, but the airport was open. And to me, school resonates right up
essential.
there. Yeah.
No, I agree. And, the CDC guidance up until COVID was schools should never close for more than, I think, 2 to 4 weeks ever. And here we are, 52 weeks in, essentially, because I think I don't even know what the date is, but I think we're at the 1-year mark. Our schools closed March 13th. Yeah.
March 13th for us too.
Yeah. And they're still not open. And the headlines stating that San Francisco schools are opening when it's, probably
So
less
misleading.
than 5% of students for part-time learning is that I can't even.
Well, they've done it the whole way. I mean, the headlines have been the whole way, right? Teacher dies of COVID. And then you actually read the article and you're like, wait, it was a teacher who died of COVID, but they made it sound like the teacher got COVID at school. And when you read the article, you're like, that person, there's no, right? The point is that the headlines are not what things are all the time.
No, it's misleading. And I think if you read the studies, which I started doing early on to avoid the headlines, but to just read the data, for school districts that have been open in the fall, in every instance, and there's tons of studies, Wisconsin, North Carolina, what we've seen happen in Rhode Island, the positivity rates in school and across Europe also are 10 times lower than they are in the community, which would suggest, or which would tell you that they actually slow the spread in communities because of the safety protocols, et cetera. And the transmission, when you hear about it with teachers, it really isn't child to teacher, it's teacher to teacher. And that seems much easier to mediate in that, adults will more easily sort of be careful and stay apart, or they're getting it outside of the school. So schools absolutely can be safe. And in fact, if the positivity, which it is lower in school, it would serve the community more broadly because it would kind of slow down the spread in the community. And talk to doctors about that, but I can read the studies. And
I hear you. What made you guys go to Denver, and how has that been? So your son's in school now?
It's 1 week. Yeah, we've only been here a week. Right now it's sort of, temporary. We still have our place in San Francisco. We had talked about a lot of different places when it became clear that schools wouldn't open, and when when our son seemed to really be withdrawing. So we talked about Florida. I mean, the filter was, our schools open? So, and are they open full time? So we talked about Denver, and we talked about Florida, and we talked about Boise, and we called a school in Denver. It's a public school. It's a bilingual school, which is, what he attends in San Francisco. And we said, can he come? And they said, yes, he can come in a week. And so we just said, okay. And, for us, Denver is a city which, we would prefer. I mean, that wasn't the first thing, but, we're city people. And it's a very diverse city, which was, of interest to us. I think his school is 30% Latinx students. So it's a very diverse school, and more diversity beyond that. But that's what we wanted. That's what we have in San Francisco. So it just ticked a lot of boxes for us. But the biggest box was, you can come in a week. We said, but we don't even have an address yet. And they said, well, you can come. So we quickly got an address and we hopped on a plane. It's only an hour and a half, flight. So I can go back and deal with what I need to do there. And we can just sort of do it temporarily for now until we see what kind of plays out in San Francisco. But so far we like it. I mean, he really likes school. I thought it would be a harder adjustment, but he gets up and goes willingly every day. He's smiling when he leaves. He doesn't tell us much, but I think that's sort of normal. He's smiling on the way there and back. So, I'm going to judge based on that. So he likes it. And, there's just youth activities, there's youth sports. So there's all kinds of activities for kids.
That's at least, I mean, look, New York, we were up there with California back when this whole thing started in terms of, the level of lockdown. The good news is we figured it out a little bit. I mean, my kids are, other than the fact that I have to, this is why I get so crazy about this, because my kids literally are doing everything else. There's we talked about, my daughter goes to gymnastics. There must be 100 kids in that room, right?
Yeah, we don't have
half of them with their masks down, doing their thing. Then she goes the next morning to play hockey. There's 16 kids on the ice. She's one of them. They don't let them wear masks at hockey. They're not even allowed to, for whatever reason. And like, they're living their lives. And then it's like, but they can't, they can't be in school 5 days a week with 20 other kids or 20 or it doesn't add up. And that's,
I mean, San Francisco's lagged in many ways. And, I don't want to get into the sort of businesses piece of it. I kind of stand down on that, but there are many businesses open that are not essential. Like, I understand why, of course, grocery stores have been open. We all need to eat, but even clubs have opened recently in San Francisco and kids still aren't in school. It just sort of is such a strong signal of where our priorities are, so I wanted to be in a place that put kids first. That was kind of what it came down to. That was it. And it is, I've been here a week, but it's very family friendly. They definitely put kids first. We're going to sign our son up for sports. He's very active. Our daughter already went to a gymnastics class. I learned on my.
Do they know who mom is at the gymnastics place?
Well, so here's the funny part. So when I landed,
not all of us know who you are.
Why would you? But when we landed in Denver last Sunday, a friend of mine from childhood that I had trained with said she was living here, which I didn't know, and that another friend of ours owned a gym here. So she does, because we actually trained together. So Ruth, my daughter, went the next day and she loved it. So just to be able to see kids being kids again, that's what was important to me. But I will say, just like you, that doesn't mean I'm going to stop pushing for schools to open everywhere. And San Francisco is still my home. Like I said, I've been there 30 years. It's the first place that ever felt like home to me. I want to go back, but I got to put my kids first,
Do you want to go back though? Like, has this, cause I feel like for me, this would put and it's done that, by the way, for me. So I'm a lifelong upstate New Yorker. I grew up here. I've lived here my whole life, and we're moving to Florida. We haven't found we just offered actually on a house yesterday. We offered 20,000 over the asking price, sight unseen, with a pre-approval letter, and we still don't know if we got it yet. We've done that on multiple houses and gotten outbid. You can't even. It's almost impossible because there's so many people. But it's really, and we're moving there. Yeah, school's not the only reason we're moving there. We got family there, and we just had a baby, and we it's time for us to go. My wife's wanted to be there for a long time, which I wish I would have listened to her 5 years ago, but now is the time for us to go. And I'm not going to miss it. Like here, I'm going to say when I leave, I'm going to say good riddance. And it's not the people. I want to be clear about that. It's not the people. I've had great experiences with my kids and with their schools and with their teachers, but it's with the system. And, I
think people's priorities are sort of reorienting and realigning. And, I agree with you. I am going to vote much more carefully in local elections. I've always voted, but, I'll be the first to admit I didn't always do a ton of research on the school board candidates. I always voted, but I knew a cursory amount, I would say. In California, when you vote, you get a book of props this big. I tried to do my research, but I could have done a better job. I'll fully admit. I'll pay more attention to that. But I will be voting for candidates who fought for schools to be open at the local level, at the national level, and this has made strange bedfellows in a sense. Never in a million years would I think, with my sort of politics, that I would end up on Fox. But schools is, I guess I'm a single issue voter now, is what I would say. And so, in answer to your question, I guess I don't know. I've only been here a week. I have 30 years worth of friends in San Francisco. So it's very difficult, but we'll see. We're in a situation where we are, renting an Airbnb, and it's only been a week. I miss my friends a lot. But we'll see, because you're right. It's not what it once was. And I see the benefits of being around a community that prioritizes children and families. I mean, San Francisco has the lowest percentage of children of any major city in America, and the highest percentage of private school students. So there just weren't a lot of people affected, frankly, by this situation that had the time, energy, means to push. And it was very difficult to get support from parents. I went to a rally that was me and two other people that people just weren't showing up back in the fall. Now it's changed and many more people are showing up, but that was disheartening for me. So I don't know. It's a question mark.
I hear you. Well, listen, these times go quick. Any last bit of advice or information you like to leave people with?
No, just think about the children, I guess, and even if you don't have children, I mean, that's one thing that's really encouraged me, is I have heard from people who have said, hearing you has changed my mind. I don't even have kids, and I hadn't really thought about it, but now I see, and I get it. Even if your kids are fine and your kids are in private, think about all the kids. We need you. And again, no one's saying your kid has to go. So, there's always a virtual option.
Right.
And I expect many people to avail themselves of that, and should, if they are afraid. I know I'm repeating myself, but please give families that want the option to send their kids to school that option. We just need to think about the future. The long-term impacts of this are grave in my estimation, and in the estimation of many,
Totally. Well, Jen, listen, it was a pleasure. It was great getting
Thanks.
to know you a little bit. I would love to talk to you again and spend a little bit more time talking about Athlete A, because
Sure.
it was such a fantastic piece, and congratulations for that and for everything else that you've done fighting for kids. It's an honor to talk to you, and you're an inspiration. So thank you.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
All right, everybody, don't forget to rate, don't forget to subscribe, don't forget to download. I will be back with you same time next week. Until then, I say peace. I'm out of here.